fiscal year commencing June 1, 2020 to May 31, 2021. Can we all kindly stand for the pledge? Deputy Mayor, would you do the honors?
So,
It's,
either way.
okay. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
If we could all remain standing for a moment of silence for our community and for all the families victimized by the pandemic everywhere.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody.
Trustee Johnson?
Here.
Trustee Hobbs?
Here.
Trustee Renfro?
Here.
Via Zoom, Trustee Daniels?
Here.
Mayor Ryan?
Yes.
No notice is hereby given that pursuant to Section 5-508 of the Village Law, the Incorporated Village of Hempstead will hold public hearing on Tuesday, April 28, 2020 at 12 noon on live stream with no public participation on Village Hall, 99 James Garner Way, Hempstead, New York. The tentative budget may be inspected in the office of the Village Clerk, 99 James Garner Way, Hempstead, New York. Take it away.
Okay, Mr. Joe Gill, it's yours.
Thank you, Mayor, trustees. I'd like to start off first with financial results from fiscal year 2019, which is the last audited year. The audit has not been certified yet. We're about to do that. The general fund had a $4.6 million surplus for fiscal year 2019.
I'm sorry, just what happened? Sorry. The general fund had
$4.6 million surplus for fiscal year 2019. And the water fund had a surplus of about $250,000. We will be finalizing that audit shortly now that our efforts are, going to be complete with the budget. We'll go towards certifying the audit, and we'll post that on the website as well.
I'm sorry, Joe, what was it, water surplus?
$250,000. If you, I handed out the revised booklet that includes some additional schedules that have not been included in the past budgets. If you look at page 43 of this year's or the next year's budget, you'll see a fund balance statement. Yes, sir.
Can you advise what the surplus was the previous year?
For 2018,
You said last year was what?
fiscal year 19 that ended a year ago.
Okay.
The surplus in the general fund was $4.6 million.
So what was it the year before?
For fiscal 18, I don't recall. So I want to make sure we're talking about the correct years. Right now we're in fiscal 20. Fiscal 19 ended in May of 2019. So you're asking about the year that ended in fiscal 18? I get to that number, but I just don't have it with me. So page 43 has fund balance starting from the fund balance that we had May 31, 2018, almost $25 million, has the operating results and the addition of the $4.6 million surplus from fiscal 2019. And this year I'm estimating in the general fund, the surplus in the general fund of about $500,000. In the water fund, I'm estimating a deficit of under $100,000. So the water fund is very close. In this current fiscal year, there's another month left. We're looking at a potential surplus in the general fund. The information on page 43 shows the history and an estimated fund balance as of the end of this current fiscal year. That's why it's estimated. It also shows for the last couple of years what the breakdown of our fund balance was by class. Fund balance has different kinds of classes. Non-spendable, which is inventory. Restricted, meaning it can only be used for specific purposes. Assigned fund balance is when the board assigns it for particular uses, such as encumbrances or things like that, or appropriating for current year budget. And then unassigned. Our unassigned budget our unassigned fund balance was about $12 million at the end of fiscal 2018. We estimate it to be over almost $16 million as of the end of this fiscal year. So we have a healthy fund balance. That's a good indicator for our finances. Regarding the budget before you today for fiscal year 2021, there is no tax levy increase. We are constricted with that anyway by the constitutional tax limit. I'll speak about that in a moment. The tax rate is actually going down very slightly. It was 85.16. It'll go down to 85.13. That is because of an increase in property values. We saw about a 4% increase in assessed values year over year. Yes?
So, you were saying that the tax, I'm sorry,
The tax rate?
yeah, I'm just listening to these horns out there.
Sorry.
You were saying that the tax rate will not go up.
The tax rate actually goes down a little
It
bit.
goes down, but you
Right,
mentioned
because
you mentioned property value.
Yes. Property values went up about 4%.
Is that going to stand now that this pandemic?
Well, that's one of the potential risks of the operating budget in the village, that property values would decrease.
Right.
If that happens, well, that would affect the constitutional tax limit, most importantly in that. Let me get back to that when I talk about the constitutional tax limit.
All right.
Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Joe, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So, I know for 5/31/19, you said 16 million, right? For the unassigned,
Correct.
right? And for 5/31/2020, we dropped by $1 million?
That's because of appropriated fund balance in the new budget.
Okay.
Yeah, that counts as a different class because it's been, or potentially will be assigned into the budget this year, appropriate for budget purposes.
Okay.
So you could add that back if you didn't have anything.
Gotcha.
Just give me a minute. I'm so sorry, Councilman. Other mask.
That's fine.
It's not fun to breathe through. I have this one. These are such crazy times. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. And I'm far away from everybody, so I'll put mine off just for easy speaking.
Can you move back a little bit?
I won't sneeze.
Well, the CDC said that they
No,
were limit
Chris, this is
6 feet and maybe 12.
1 second.
Right,
Trustee
right.
Daniels, 1 second, the reporter's putting on her mask, so she can't get you.
I don't think I'll be able to get.
Okay, Jeff.
All right.
Do
Okay.
you have a question, Jeff? It's frozen.
Is he frozen?
Trustee Daniels?
We lost the feed.
No, we can't have lost the feed.
You ready?
Nope.
Yes.
So if I'm reading it, the 5,095,675 that was appropriated from the 2019, sorry, the 4,507.
Trustee Daniels, I'm so sorry. We have like people beeping their horns out here and you coming, I can't
We're
hear
gonna have
you.
to put it into those horn blowers.
Can you
It's
just-
very
You
distracting.
did.
Perhaps just repeat what you said. I have,
Go ahead, Jeff. Just say it again.
I heard you say upon reading.
Go ahead.
Hold on.
Just to clear, the 4,507,708 from the appropriated fund balance of 5/31/2018,
Yes,
that rolls into the 2019 budget, correct?
yes. Well, it rolls into fund balance and is reappropriated technically.
And then we reappropriated.
At the end of the year, appropriated fund balance would either be used to balance the expenses of the village, or it just goes back into fund balance, and then there's another appropriation.
Thank you.
So when we roll, when we look at the estimated.
We lost your,
Surplus
Yeah, so on the top, estimated operating, there's a typo there. 547, 728?
547, 728. What does that represent?
That's this current fiscal year that ends in 30 days.
So that's basically saying we spent everything except for 547, 728.
No, that would also mean that we didn't spend the $5 million that was appropriated in fund balance.
Yes, thank you.
Your audio is frozen, our video is frozen.
Yeah.
Yeah, the 5 million goes back in. It would be a deficit if we had to use the fund balance.
Okay, got it.
Okay?
Yes.
Any other questions regarding the history of the fund balance and the estimates? We can go back to that if you'd like. So back to current year budget, I did say that property values increased about 4%.
What page are you on?
I'm just back to my notes, I'm not in the budget right now. In addition, there is no increase in the sanitation fee in this budget. And also, there's no increase in the water rate, which we can talk about in a few minutes. The idea being that, given the uncertainty of current events, it'd be questionable to raise fees to our residents. So that was what was kind of guiding my direction into this budget and trying to keep the numbers as low as possible. So I want to talk now about the constitutional tax limit. Going into this fiscal year, as approved by the state controller, our constitutional tax limit had reached 94%, which leaves us very little room. We have not increased taxes in 5 years now. If we saw a 20% decrease in property values, we would be back to 100% of that tax limit. We fortunately did see a 4% increase in property values this year. It's our hope, of course, that the property values will not be severely impacted by current events and the economic situation that we're in right now. So the increase in the taxable value of 4% is helpful. That brings down the tax rate a little bit because property values went up. So that's where you end up with your millage coming down. It's not really a millage because we base it on 100 rather than 1,000. But the tax rate was 85.16. It will be 85.13 under this budget. Regarding the constitutional tax limit again, with this budget, we would be no worse than we were last year at 94%, depending on what I can convince the state controller to accept as capital within our operating budget. We could get down to about 90 to 91% if I can convince them that some items are capital that they might not accept. Something like a vehicle, they obviously will accept, but other purchases sometimes are not quite to the threshold as being capital. They did reduce our capital in the budget, in operating budget last year, and that's where we ended up at 94%. But again, we are vulnerable to a decrease in property values. That is an issue that we're going to have to keep our eyes on. Now into some detail of the budget. Budget year over year. For salaries, there's a 0.67% increase. There are contracts pending, both for civil service, CSEA, and contract negotiation pending, and for police. So we don't know what that's going to be yet. But in this budget as it stands, there's a less than a 1% increase in salaries, $260,000. In equipment, that is down 34% this year. That's $685,000 approximately decrease in equipment across the general fund. Contractual expenses go up about 8%, $827,000. And the cost of benefits goes up also about 8%. That's $1.9 million. Overall, the budget is only up 3.3%. I went through the budget many times to try to...
Overall budget is up what?
3.3%. That's $2.7 million. I went several iterations through this budget to try to minimize expense, compare it to multiple years in the past, averages, historic, what people were spending their budget on, and tried to reduce it wherever I could, and holding it to $2.7 million over last year's budget was not easy to accomplish, but I was able to do so. We are using more fund balance in this budget. However, there are we've budgeted similar amounts of fund balance in the past and still ended up with a surplus that did not burn that fund balance. The fund balance is what's keeping us going, what's keeping our financial status healthy. As long as we can maintain fund balance, we're okay. But over the long run, eventually, as expenses increase, we will run into difficulties with the relative inability to raise taxes. As expenses continue to grow, we're not going to have revenue to offset the increases in those expenses. So that's something we're going to have to manage and keep an eye on in the years to come. This year in particular, there are obviously risks involved. We don't know what the future holds as far as this health issue, the virus that we have. We are still continuing to fund our programming, such as parks and recreation. We don't know if we'll be able to open parks or swimming pools. But we've budgeted that in case we can. If we can't, in a way, it's an opportunity, not really a positive opportunity, but it's a budget opportunity in that we wouldn't have those expenses to put out if we can. Also have about $3 million, I'm sorry, $2.5 million, $2.5 million funded in this budget for termination pay. Historically, what we budget for fund balance, what we budget for termination pay has not come to be the actual number, that there's budget savings in there. So with $2.5 million, that's an increase of $500,000 over last year in budgeted termination pay. So I don't know whether people plan to retire and will actually get closer to that number that we have in the past. But history says that not everybody that puts in for retirement does retire in that fiscal year. So there are obviously, given current events and the economic situation, those are the big risks, in a way that it also provides some opportunities, such as there might be some state or federal funding that might become available to offset some of our expenses during the furlough of employees and the operations within the village that are essential tasks to the operating of the village. So there is a slight technical issue with what was in the paper. There are allocations from the general fund to the water fund, and that is for the full-time employees of particular departments, administrative departments, the board, the mayor, treasurer, clerk, that's allocated to the water fund. So the lines that are in that publication for general government services are slightly overstated, and the interfund transfers are slightly understated. It's still the same number. It's still the 86,396, 620 bottom line as far as the budget turns. $86,396,620 was the sum total of all the expenses and revenues in this budget. So that, depending on where you do these allocations, changes what those functions of government are, whether it be general government support or the interfund transfers. So that's just a minor technical issue that you might see a difference in those summaries, but the sum of the budget, all the numbers that are in the tentative budget are what's presented here today. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Can you, just your professional opinion, what are the three most concerning things about this budget?
The three most what? Concerning?
Yes.
One would be the use of fund balance. It is about 7%, I believe.
7 or 7?
7% of the budget, and that means we are at an imbalance. Our recurring revenues do not meet our recurring expenses. Fortunately, there are things that are put in our budget, like I said, the termination pay that usually is not fully spent There's also some money in police that is there in case they were to staff up closer to the 130 level. They are not there. They're about 112 last count. So there is money that are in police salaries that would also be available to, potentially available to offset the use of fund balance. I would say that the revenue line for the court is $3 million. That is in anticipation of the contract approved by this board, I believe in the summer, with FBS that would assist in bringing in more revenues. That has not really moved at this point in time. But that is the expectation under that contract and under the agreement with FBS and the services that we believe they'd be able to provide.
But conservatively speaking, what would have been the estimate? What's the estimate of the income?
2.5. So it's about $500,000 higher than what this year's result is going to be. We're about 2.3, 2.4, so in that range. And a third concern, I can't think of a third concern. We have continued growth in expenses and we don't have the revenues to match it. So overall, I would say that's just the biggest general concern is the structural imbalance that we have where the recurring revenues are prohibitive or we're prohibited from raising them and we have very limited funding sources for revenue in the village and we see our expenses continue to grow. So we have to manage those expenses and try to see here that would give us a couple of years, only 3 years after this one. If we were to continue, if we burned everything in the budget this year, which is unlikely, and continue to burn at that rate. So we have some time to try to balance our structural problem. But at some point in time, we've run out of fund balance. So it looks 2 to 3 years, maybe 4, but that assumes worst case scenario in this budget and budget every year. So that's probably the worst case scenario, 3 to 4 years after this one.
Right, and again, with this pandemic that we're dealing with and other things, I just wanted that projection because it's important that we understand that if we don't make some adjustments and some changes, we're talking about a 3 to 4 year window, and that's not good.
Correct. And to be out of fund balance and no ability to raise taxes would create a big problem. If we do exceed, if we were to see a 20% decrease in property values, and that could happen, it could. I hope it does not. But if that were to happen, then we would be at 100% of the constitutional tax limit. And this is different. Don't misunderstand the constitutional tax limit versus the tax cap. The tax cap everyone's heard about, that's the annual increase in your tax levy year over year. And that's limited to the lower of what the inflation is or 2%. So that's what everybody refers to as the tax cap. What I'm referring to is the constitutional tax limit. A lot of people don't realize this exists. But you're only allowed to collect a certain percentage of your assessed value in your taxes. And when you get to that level where you cannot raise your taxes or you've reached that constitutional tax limit, you're not allowed to raise your taxes anymore. And there's no leeway, there's no, okay, it's all right this time. It's absolute. And what happens is the state would then decrease any state aid by an amount that you are over that constitutional tax limit. So it's somewhere you don't want to get to. Because we do have other revenue pieces that come in from the state that they would start to withhold because we exceeded the constitutional tax limit. So we don't want that to happen. We want to continue to have surpluses that we can put in there and hopefully add on to what that window is, 3-4 years currently at worst case scenario. If we continue to show surpluses, then we don't have the issue at all. But the constitutional tax limit, there were a couple places in New York State that have reached it, and they've looked for ways out of that. It's a tough situation. We are fortunate that we are only at about 15% of our debt limit, but you can't borrow to get out of your problem. So Jamestown, New York reached their debt limit and their tax limit, and there's nowhere for them to turn really. They were fortunate in that they had some growth, so they're working their way out of that. But yeah, to reach your tax limit is a serious thing. There's no other way around it. The way out of that is property growth or cut your expenses. Property assessed value growth or cut your expenses. So those are the choices we're looking at down the road. If we're to continue to burn fund balance in a worst case scenario, at some point in time, we would have to see how we could cut expenses so as to not need any more tax money than the levy that we have. We did have 4% growth prior to this pandemic. There was 4% growth in property taxes, which is helpful every little bit. If we saw prior to this pandemic, if we had a 13% growth in property values, we'd get to 80% of that constitutional tax levy. We're more likely, given this, though, to see a decrease in the next assessment roll that comes out January 1, 2021. So there's a lot of unknowns.
What does that 4% mean, fund-wise?
Well, the tax levy is the same. So the result is that the property values go up, the levy stays the same, the millage comes down a little bit. So that's where you'll see the difference. So the way to determine what your tax rate is, it's the amount of the levy as the numerator of the fraction. The total taxable assessed value is the denominator. That fraction gives you, and you divide by 100, that gives you the tax rate. So you've got the two pieces. You've got the amount of the tax levy on top. That stays the same. You have the denominator, though, increasing. That makes the tax rate smaller. So those are the numbers that are involved. The tax levy over the total assessed value, taxable assessed value, equals the tax rate. So if you leave taxes alone, an increase in that denominator, taxable assessed value.
I'm sorry, if you leave taxes alone.
If you leave taxes alone and no longer, and don't increase the tax levy, but you have an increase in your property values, that millage comes down.
I would like to know the pros and cons of development. If we start any development, how will that help us? I would like to know the pros and cons.
Development would bring in, assuming that it was not under pilot, it would bring in taxable assessed value, which would increase the overall taxable assessed value of the village. It does not increase the tax levy. So what would happen is, by increasing taxable value and the levy staying the same, the millage would continue to come down. So that would be helpful to everybody else that's in that tax pool. As the denominator gets bigger, by adding taxable assessed value, the millage gets smaller. I refer to it as millage, but it's per hundred. It's commonly called millage anyway.
You commented
So-
if that has no,
Can you clarify that a little bit? Russ? No.
Mhm.
Yes, there's an impact. If it's piloted, there's an impact on the assessed value and you have a denominator effect. So I get that, right? You're freeing up space. But even under pilots, right, there's a revenue that
Right.
comes in that's going to reduce the overall levy. That's going to have impact as well.
Yes, yeah, that was the next part of what I was going to say, that the other side of that is if you get development that is under pilot, you're going to get your pilot payment, which obviously can incentivize bringing in those developments. But that pilot payment would be on top of the tax levy. For instance, we had somebody, a property that went off pilot at the end of this year, I believe. So their assessed value will go back into the pool of assessed values and they come off the pilot list. So it's supposed to be a wash. When a property comes off that pilot, the pilots are supposed to be structured in such a way that the amount of the pilot payment will equal what the tax will be when the pilot's over. It's a guess because you're doing pilots 10, 20 years ahead of time, but you make your best guess that you can. And the idea is that when a property comes off of pilot and into the assessable tax area, that they're going to end up paying about the same, whether it was the pilot or their taxes. But what happens is they're going to go into the pool without us increasing the tax levy. Everybody else is going to go down by a little bit by the amount of their taxes or their taxes that went from pilot to tax, but divided by everybody in the village. So when a pilot comes off, they'll go into the regular assessable tax valuation part of the roll, and then they're subject to taxes. But the only way to increase revenue is to increase taxes. So if the rate comes down, which is what we would like to see too, But again, we're running into the problem of, we're gonna run out of revenue at some point in time. So at some point, we need to raise taxes.
Can you just go back, just to clear
Yes.
something up? During the piloted period,
Mhm.
can you explain what the effect is on the rest of the community?
Okay, well, the pilot payments are in addition to the tax levy. So the idea of the pilot is to incentivize development and maybe give it in or have it be at a reduced rate relative to their taxes, because you might want affordable housing. If you want affordable housing, there has to be an incentive to have that development come in. Otherwise, what's the point of building something they're going to lose money on? So developers will come in if there's an incentive, and if you want there to be affordable housing in that development, then the pilot makes more sense to offset some of that, what they would have as a loss.
But what's the effect on the homeowner?
It's the same. If there's new development that comes in with a pilot, the tax levy is going to stay the same. People have to pay the same thing. The taxable value of a development that's on pilot is not in the mix as far as the tax rate is concerned. Their taxable value is not part of that denominator of that fraction, because they're not taxable, they're under pilot.
All right.
Is that what you meant?
Yes, let's talk specifically about the village of Hempstead.
But,
Oh, go ahead.
but Joe, look, so if you looked at the budget, there's like a source use in the budget, right? It shows where the funds are coming from to get to your actual tax levy.
What page are you referring to, Trustee Daniels?
Page 3, I think. No?
Okay, so page on page 3, your appropriation number, right?
Yeah.
Is included, that's all of the expenses basically, right?
The appropriations are all the expenses.
Dig in?
The appropriations, that top line there is all of the appropriations, the expenses.
Right, that's all the expenses. So you're backing out from that expenses those other revenues to get down to the actual tax levy that's going to be onto homeowners, correct?
Correct. Which has been the same for 5 years.
Correct. So if you had a pilot, I think I'm just trying to more directly answer the counselor's question. If you had a pilot, the estimated non-tax revenues would be higher.
Correct.
So the actual amount of tax levy would be less.
Right.
So that's less burden that would then be sprinkled out across the plate to everybody.
Yes.
Right, that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yes.
So while
Yeah.
it doesn't do anything for the assessed value while it's off the rolls as a pilot, it still reduces the overall levy that is now being sprinkled out among all the homeowners and commercial.
Correct.
businesses.
Yeah, so
it
yes,
does have a positive effect on the finances of the homeowners and the business owners.
Right,
Yeah,
that's
so-
what I'm
yeah.
trying to, that's what I wanted him to explain.
So yes, there is a benefit to pilots in that they reduce the amount needed to be generated by the levy. And I think that's kind of what you're looking for.
Right. So then my follow-up to that is with in the financial state that we are in currently, right? Does it behoove us to have more development, even if it's piloted, in order to reduce the burden on taxpayers, residential taxpayers?
Yes. Yeah, any way, whether it's through pilot or for taxable assessed value, either way increases our revenue opportunities.
Okay, so now, how does that, during a pilot period, how does it affect our services, right? Sanitation costs, police costs, any municipal services, how are the homeowners affected? How is our budget affected?
During a pilot period?
Yes, and we're talking about pilots for residential, for apartments, for instance, I'll just say it straight out.
But, I mean, it would depend on the development. I don't know if you
Right.
answer, it's not a specific formula to that. There's obviously going to be costs associated with whether it be trash hauling, if it's not private, it's public, additional policing, even though it depends on what the use is as well, in terms of policing.
Correct.
So there, I'm not saying that there's revenue without some expense. There's definitely minutes.
So I'm looking at the sanitation user fee, trustee
Yeah,
Daniels.
well, let me interrupt for a moment. Obviously, I know where this is going. Let's just cut the chase.
I think it's a.
Obviously,
Wait,
you have more
he's still-
developments.
he's still voting.
and- oh, I
He's still
didn't-
voting.
I can't hear him.
Go ahead,
You
Jeff.
have more development.
I'm not deceiving, I don't know the right words, so I'm going to use deceiving. I don't mean that in a negative connotation when I say it. I don't know, is the stenographer, is she following me?
No, we missed it.
Well, I think I'm creating a nice clean record, but it
Make
did-
note
can you
of
stop?
1% increase in assessed
Sir.
value.
You can't, hold
I
on.
can't even see him. Can you
Yeah.
raise that computer up? I mean, I had no idea you'd be coming in this Zoom and would have asked for better placement of the computer.
Go ahead.
How's that today?
Okay. Can you see
All right,
me?
so what were you saying, Jeff? Can you repeat what you were saying?
I would just say, earlier you made note to the 4% increase in assessed value. That while that provides some comfort, it does not take into account the amount of tax surcharge that we actually refund back to people. Again, these are just the assessed values. They're not taking, contemplating, you know, we have a number in the budget, it doesn't contemplate how much of that assessed value is actually going to be. So it's kind of a false comfort level. If you would. We have a history of heavy grievances because our tax roll is very challenged.
Right.
Right.
So,
And let me get a chance to say something.
Sure.
Obviously, the tax cert that's referenced probably needs a revow, and that might help us a bit.
but it would meet the
Well,
entire
let me
village
continue.
to be reassessed.
For example, I think it would probably cost us, is $1 million safe to say for a revow?
Probably 2 million.
All right, if it's 2 million, then what does it cost us now with the tax cert situation?
More than 2 million a year.
Okay, that's the point taken.
Yeah.
But I would like to point out a couple other quick things. Obviously, development,
Yeah.
smart growth would be a plus.
Yeah.
Here's our, yeah. Well,
No. When
One second. No, we're not.
I asked the
I'm having a
question,
problem finishing my thought. I think I should have.
when I asked the question, it was, when I asked Joe Gill the question, several other people, I never got an answer for my question. I asked him the pros and cons, other people got involved, and they started speaking. I never was able to hear the answer to my question. Everybody else interjected. I didn't hear a clear and precise answer from Joe Gill. Other people jumped in. I never got to get the answer to my question.
So, pros and cons of pilots?
Yes,
Um,
from Joe Gill.
Yeah. Look, it depends on the structure of the pilot. It depends on how it's structured and whether you're putting an incentive in there for affordable housing. It depends, it goes from deal to deal. Some are going to be better than others. It depends on the ramp. Generally, pilots are meant to be an incentive to come in and to provide certainty to developers when there's uncertainty. And that's during their construction period and during their rent-up period. For the time it takes them to put the shovel in the ground at first until the time they're about 90% full could be a couple of years. And if they don't know what their expenses are going to be, it can be a problem for them because they can't plan. So that's generally why you start a pilot. In addition, you could do it for affordable housing, where you're going to try to offset or give some reduction in what they would pay in taxes if they were at full value to provide more affordable housing for your residents. So there's different objectives involved with different pilots. So it's hard to say across the board, what pros and cons are. It depends on how good a deal you can make. If you're bringing in development that you wouldn't otherwise get, that's a good thing. If you're bringing in something that's going to be forever on pilot, well, I don't know. It depends on what those values are. Yes, sir.
And for the record, my question was development. I didn't say pilots or not. Other people injected the pilot.
Okay.
So I'm not asking, I asked about development. Everybody else injected the pilot thing. That wasn't what I was asking. I said development.
So development.
And then other people injected the pilot.
Okay. Yeah, you're correct. Yes, that is what you said. That is where you started. So is development good? Yes, because it brings taxable assessed value to it. Whether it be one way or the other, it would be through taxable assessed value or for revenue other than tax, which would include pilot payments. The question is, what kind of development do you want? And that's not for me to answer, but development is good because it brings in taxable assessed value, which everybody gets to share in that value as far as their taxes are concerned.
All right, thank you. So my question.
Mayor, I'm sorry.
Okay, the point about development, I think we all agree smart growth is important. And going forward, we're less than a year away from the election, I'm sure this will be a campaign issue, which brings up a thought. During a campaign, if you make a promise, it is my opinion, you keep your promise. And that enters into the thought process, particularly, not just what you said, but particularly when it comes to the word pilot. Also, now that we're in a pandemic, many of us are beginning to see the density in this village and elsewhere in the world is something that have a negative effect. And I think it's important for us to keep the thought of density important. We have the largest village in the state of New York, and adding additional people would have to increase the density just from a common sense perspective. So I just wanted to cite those, but I don't want to get too far away from your budget presentation. Maybe we could save this for the obvious, and then
Well,
see
there
if
is
we can
another
finish.
point, though. In our assessment, we only have one class of property.
That's true, and we need that
And
too.
there really, most places have done a reassessment in their history. The village has been here a long time, and we're still relying on numbers that were generated, I believe, in the 1940s. And it's only one class.
Yes,
And commercial properties and residential properties do not fluctuate within the same boundaries or within the same time frame. So if you want to talk about revaluation, I think it's important that we consider that and really look at the numbers, maybe get a quote and see what that can provide for us. Because right now we are paying a lot as far as tax certiorari claims are concerned, which is an indicator that the commercial properties are overvalued. The cost of a one-time reval would give us a far more defensible role, and therefore our tax certiorari should come down permanently when you do the one shot as far as the revaluation is concerned. So, yes, development is good in the right way, but I think a revaluation is something that we need to look at going forward, so we have a better tax roll. There could be properties there that have been undervalued for decades, and we will never know. They'll never pay their fair share of taxes either, because they're undervalued. And they'll never get a new value, because they've never been revalued. They will always be in that situation. So there quite possibly are properties out there that are not paying their fair share, while others are overpaying and having to sue the village to get it back, meaning the tax certiorari. So that it's an important thing going forward as far as property values and taxable assessed valuation is concerned, and for the health of the village.
thank you.
Right, so, and if there was, there should be a difference between commercial tax assessed value compared to residential. It shouldn't be evenly dispersed, right?
Correct. Typically, commercial properties have a higher tax rate than residential properties, because commercial properties generally are more expensive. They're more expansive, more square footage, they're steel and cement and harder materials. And it also, like I said, fluctuates more over time. I believe that commercial properties are more of a lagging value, and residential, there's more property turnover in the residential area, so you're going to get a more accurate number in a revaluation in those because there's more sales involved. And commercial property can also fluctuate based on the use. So there really should be two classes. And what happens too is the two classes will work off of each other. I did a reval in the prior village that I was with, and when you do that revaluation, you set up what they call base proportions. The base proportions there were 85 for residential and 15% for commercial. That meant that the residential properties paid 85% of the tax levy, and the commercial properties paid 15% of the tax levy. Well, this was 08-09, so commercial property values tended to go down a little bit, where property values for residential went down but came back. So what happened was that original 85 residential, 15% commercial, shifted. So the commercial properties got almost to 13% of the tax levy as opposed to 15. So that shifted the taxes over to the residential, where property values were increasing. So in a time where commercial property values started to dip, their burden under taxes would dip a little bit, making them more attractive to someone to come buy them. And that brings their values back up. And then they take back that part of the tax levy. And that is relief from your residential property owners, because the commercial property draws off more as they become more valuable. So it's a very complicated thing when you get into assessment and splits and which development is good. You know, commercial would be good if you had a separate class for that, and that would relieve the burden from the residentials.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay, your presentation's concluded. Anybody have any questions? Okay, can entertain a motion?
With a motion to
Close the hearing.
to close.
Well, yeah, the deputy mayor stepped out for a moment.
Yeah.
Okay.
There it is.
Hearing no more questions, I'm willing to entertain a motion that this hearing be closed.
So moved. Second.
Trustee Johnson? Trustee Hobbs?
Yes.
Trustee Renfro?
Yes.
Trustee Daniels?
Yes.
Mayor Ryan?
Yes. And now, we'll move forward. And the second public hearing has to do with the water rate for the fiscal year commencing June 1, 2020 to May 31, 2020.
She didn't understand you.
The water rate
We're ready for
for the fiscal year commencing June 1, 2020 to May 31, 2020.
Trustee Hobbs?
Here.
Trustee Renfro?
Here.
Trustee Daniels?
Yes.
Mayor Ryan?
Yes.
Please take notice that pursuant to Article 2 of the Municipal Home Rule Law and the provisions of the law. I'll make a copy for you, okay?
Well, I'd like to, I
Yeah.
think I so I don't have to fill it in later.
Okay, you will. Before I
So
go.
please take notice that pursuant to something.
Pursuant to, I'm gonna go through, okay?
You want to take mine and give it back after you copy it?
Just one, two.
Or he can shoot it up.
Here you go.
I have to hear it, I can't see it. Everyone, I thank you all for
Okay,
your
please
help.
take notice that pursuant to Article 2 of the Municipal Home Rule Law and the provisions of the law of the State of New York, public hearing will be held Village Hall, 99 James Garner Way, Hempstead, New York, on April 28, 2020, immediately following the budget hearing, on which to be set to consider changes in the water rate billing of the Incorporated Village of Hempstead. All persons interested shall have an opportunity to be heard on said proposal at the time and place aforesaid. Please take it away. Joe?
So the proposal before the board is to keep all water rates the same, under the same argument or reasoning behind the tax levy and the sanitation fees. Given all the unknowns in the economy, it would make sense to hold these steady. Why have additional burden to our ratepayers? So all rates would remain the same. We are actually appropriating slightly less fund balance than last year. We did have a surplus last year in water, and this would call for, let's see, we appropriated and did not use $536,000 last year in fund balance in the water fund. This year's proposal is $492,000 in appropriated fund balance. So it's less. We've shown the surplus from last year. The water department will have some very large expenses coming its way. We are starting to do some studies for the 1,4-dioxane. And of course, there is the infrastructure issues that we have. So there are some large expenses coming our way as far as water is concerned. But given the uncertainty of the markets, I've held water rates the same across the board.
On this particular paper, it says 2% rate increase.
That was from last year, so that header was copied over from last year.
It's
The rates are the
inapplicable.
same, this is not, this is a 0%.
Yeah, that was
Last year, there was a 2% rise into fiscal year 2020. The proposal for fiscal year 2021 is to hold them all the same.
Okay.
And there was sufficient revenue developed from last year to create a surplus. So it's not, holding the rates the same should not cause a deficit.
So do you have a page where it says that the water rate is the same?
I don't have that in the budget, that's not been part of the budget document itself, but there is that memo.
So when this go out to the public, how will it read?
Well, we just changed that line under the header, just change the header, everything else will remain the same.
Questions, please? If any?
I'll just have a quick,
Oh, okay. Just making sure you're there.
oh, sorry, comment. I just would agree with the controller, Joe, that I think there's, I don't know if it hurt, but there's some big ticket items coming down the pipe for the water community. Whether it be one for dioxane, additional staffing necessary, the demand outstripping supply issues. We got test wells that we've been drilling. That water will then have to get pumped into the system and treated. So we have some big ticket items coming down the pipe here in the village as far as water is concerned.
So then I would like to follow up on that. Did you finish, Jeff? Did you finish?
Yes.
How do we plan to fund those big ticket items?
We're going to have to fund them by borrowing, because they're going to be that big. You wouldn't be able to handle it through operating. There's a couple of projects that are $12 million each, and those are anticipated within the next 5 years. Fortunately, we don't have that much debt in the water fund. There's I think it's under $4 million. Yes, outstanding debt in the debt in the water fund is under $4 million, which is relatively low considering the operation. But that will be the means, and borrowing for water purposes does not count against your borrowing limit. There's a constitutional tax limit, there's also a constitutional debt limit.
What does that mean? You don't have to pay it back?
No, you have to pay it back, but it doesn't count against your borrowing limit. So it doesn't impact what your ratio is as far as Wall Street's concerned for your bond rating. I mean, they would see the debt outstanding, but it doesn't count against your limit. They don't want to discourage investment in water systems.
Just for the public, the Deputy Mayor Charles Renfro and Trustee Jeffrey Daniels are assigned to the Water Department. I want to recognize that it is a daunting assignment and thank them for their service, because water right now has a very serious issue.
I apologize, it just has to be because of speaking into the mic and me not being so familiar with the names. I really didn't understand what you said. I had.
Yeah, but the filtering, she's having trouble.
Let me try it again.
And maybe you can do it without the mic, maybe not speak into the mic.
In any case, I said that the Deputy Mayor,
Is that better?
Well, I'm just having a hard time hearing them because of the feedback on the mic.
are we together now? No, yes?
As you speak into the mic, I can't hear you. Yeah, it's better without the mic, because of feedback.
An oxymoron.
Yes, I know, isn't that silly? I'm so sorry. Okay, so for the public, the deputy mayor.
Deputy Mayor Charles Renfro and Trustee Jeffrey Daniels are the two members of the board that are assigned to the Water Department. And I wanted to applaud the fact that that's a daunting assignment, and I'm pleased that they're handling it well, because the big ticket items coming up are vital for the village.
Much easier to do without that.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. With the, I know there was an issue at one time that quite a few of the batteries on the readers were dead, and so most of that was an estimate. Did they make that correction, and did we see that there was a big difference in what was estimated and what was actual?
I believe there were about 80 accounts that had remote meter reading, that the batteries were decaying or had died. So they were going around to replace them one by one. They have to do that, go out there and do it. I have not heard any major discrepancy between them. I haven't seen that coming in as corrections or anything like that. But they started the project to go around. I don't think that they've gotten much more than 10 or 15% into it.
That is true, they have not finished.
So again,
Yeah.
we know there could be a difference between an estimate and
Sure.
actual.
Sure. But we hit the revenue number last year, so, yeah, the incremental difference could be potentially a loss, could potentially a gain too.
All right. Thank you.
Any other questions, please?
What time is lunch?
Entertain a motion that this hearing on the water rate be closed.
So move.
Second.
Trustee Johnson?
Yeah.
Trustee Hobbs?
Yes.
Trustee Renfro?
Yes.
Trustee Daniels?
Yes.
Mayor Ryan?
Yes. And now, a special meeting for April 28th, let me correct, 2020.
Yes, you're right, Mr. Mayor, 2020. Trustee Johnson?
Here.
Trustee Hobbs?
Yes.
Trustee Renfro?
Yes.
Trustee Daniels?
Yes.
Mayor Ryan?
Yes.
So our first item reads, resolved that upon recommendation of Kevin Colvin, Assistant Chief of Police, the board trustees hereby
Sorry,
approve.
you closed the water rates hearing, right?
Yes, we did.
So now you have to go to a special meeting.
Oh, I'm sorry, I just did.
They have to vote on the water rates.
I
Close the hearing.
did.
We did.
We did.
Were you there?
No,
Yes.
I thought she closed it.
I thought you just closed
You're
the
right.
water, I thought
We
you
closed
closed
Close
the
the
hearing.
hearing.
Right, but now you need to vote on the water rates.
Right, we closed.
Oh, we are? Oh, I didn't know
No,
that.
I thought you voted on that at the next meeting.
No, we don't.
You voted on the same meeting? The water rates?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
That's what
No,
he
no,
was
no,
saying.
no.
That's
So
what
then you need to vote
confused
on
me.
it.
Now, which is like, okay.
Sorry.
I just, no, you moved on. That's why I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, yeah.
why. Okay, so we're gonna go back. We are on the special meeting on the first item. Resolved that upon recommendation of Kevin Colvin.
No, you didn't vote on the water rates.
We're gonna vote on the hearing day. I mean, when we approve the budget, we're gonna approve the water rate. That's what we do. So you
Okay.
wanna vote on it?
So,
That's up to the
That's what I
board.
thought. so you closed the water hearing,
Uh-huh.
fine. Now, did you open a special meeting?
Yes, we just did.
Okay, so we don't need the court reporter for the special meeting.
It's okay.
You gotta keep
Remember,
her-
we need the transcript as well.
Anyway, right, okay,
Yeah, so she's here, might as well do it.
okay.
Okay, so, special meeting, first item. Again, we're voting on the water rates and the hearing on the same day. I think it will be on May 5th, okay? Resolved that upon recommendation of Kevin Colvin, Assistant Chief of Police, the board of trustees hereby approves to schedule a public hearing.
Excuse me.
Yes,
Between this and the-
okay,
Just slow down a little bit, because we have a
sure.
beautiful accent.
Resolved that upon recommendation of Kevin Colvin, Assistant Chief of Police, the board trustees hereby approves to schedule a public hearing to be held on May 5th, 2020 at 12 noon. Said hearing is being held to consider receiving funds through the United States Department of Justice, Office of Justice Programs, Bureau of Justice Assistance, Justice Assistant Grant Program, local solicitation, being the coronavirus emergency supplemental funding in the sum of $96,891.
Excelente.
Okay. Second, trustee Hobbs made the motion. Who's second? Trustee Johnson?
Well, let's ask a question.
I'm really confused. Please, I have to put a speaker designation in what everybody says, and you're responding to something that.
Actually, we don't really need you for the special meeting.
No, we need to have a transcript anyway. What she said was trustee Hobbs made the motion.
Trustee Hobbs made the motion.
Okay, I don't even have trustee Hubbs making the motion.
He said excelente.
Well, yeah, but understand, like,
Can you make
it's,
it-
Soy removal.
okay. Okay, why don't you, Ms. Press, second trustee Hobbs made the motion, okay.
The motion was made by trustee Hobbs, and the second was by trustee Renfro. Trustee Johnson? Trustee Hobbs?
C.
Trustee Renfro?
Yes.
Trustee Daniels?
Yes.
Mayor Ryan?
Yes.
Okay, we're moving on to the next item, and that's it for today. Resolved that after recommendation of Mayor John Ryan, the Board of Trustees hereby approve for the Village of Hempstead to enter into an agreement with Baseline Health to provide antibody testing to all full-time village employees.
So moved.
Second question. What about the part-time employees? What about the part, we all are part-timers, so I'm just wondering.
Actually, it says full-time.
Right.
If there's a comment on your side, the agreement on the part of the board can be changed. We were mimicking what they are doing with the other villages.
And also for financial reasons,
Most of them, all of them pick just full-time for
You
financial
could do
reasons.
full-time and electeds.
Huh?
You could do full-time and electeds.
Full-time and elected officials.
You can, make that amendment. So,
Is
So it
that
would be
something that
full-time.
we could do, we're looking to do?
I'm not, I'm talking about me, myself. I was in my own time.
I'm messing with you.
It's optional on the part of our full-time employees.
Okay.
If they do take the test, the result goes to the employee. They have to self-report.
Oh, I see.
Right, the village would get a census report.
Yes,
Yes.
the
that
village
we
is
would
gonna
get.
know what percentage of the full-time workforce.
We'll know
that's
who.
about it. Not who, we'll know how many.
Deputy Mayor, you finished with your question? 'Cause
I'm finished because, I'm done.
So, I have a question. I think this should be inclusive of our first responders, which is the fire department. Because they are considered, not quote unquote employees, but they are.
No, they are supposed to be in here, that we need to make that.
Okay, so we need to.
Because they're not employees.
Right,
We're essential.
essentially.
We did discuss that. So when Patricia drafted the resolution, I didn't make that correction. It's supposed to be full-time employees and volunteers of the fire department.
And the opinion of the board as to part-time employees of the village of Hempstead.
That's
Question
not-
raised by the deputy mayor.
No, someone made that clear, it said elected officials.
Or could change it too.
So,
If we want to.
now,
This is optional to everybody.
It's optional for everybody.
Whoever is.
Well, you have to pay the $30.
If
No,
they take the test, it's $30.
but not for our employees, they're not.
No.
We're
That's on
covering,
us.
right,
The
Full-time.
burden of the expense is on Joe Gill.
right. So, on Joe Gill.
So I'll just say that full-time employees is about 400, that's $12,000.
If they all take the
If
exam.
they all
If
took
they-
it,
right.
if you're opening it up to the fire department, first responders, there's a couple hundred of them, so that would be another $6,000 if everybody took it. But
Yeah, well, listen.
probably money well
so you
spent.
have one.
Well, but I am,
Yeah, hold on.
I want to be clear for the record that we are including our first responders, whether they take it or not,
Right.
because I think it's only fair
What?
that,
That was the intent.
trustee, just to correct you, I'm saying Hempstead Fire Department, not first responders.
Hempstead Fire.
Fire department
Hempstead Fire
members.
Department members, yes, absolutely.
So why don't you reread it so we all agree?
No, I'm not finished. I'm not finished.
I just have a question about that as well. Go ahead. I have a question about the fire department.
Go ahead, I'll let you do your question when I'm finished.
I don't know what the requirements are for volunteer, but is it gonna be all members of the fire department with a certain hours? Or have you just ever joined?
Any active member of the Hempstead Fire.
And do you have, does the fire department have a list of what they deem, who they deem active?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, no problem. So
Yes.
active members.
Active members, yes. My second recommendation is, we're talking now maybe what, maybe 20,000?
Yeah, we're in the ballpark.
Okay.
If everybody were to take it.
And that's if everybody would take it.
Right.
Our we have quite a few part-time employees that during this pandemic have been considered essential employees that work on the garbage truck. And I think it's only fair to every employee that have been essential, whether it's full-time or part-time, to be included in this also.
You know how many part-timers we have?
And again, it's gonna be their choice, but I think we should offer it to them, especially if they're out
It's
there
not all part-timers now.
making themselves.
I think once you
Open the
do
door.
that, you should open the door.
Yeah,
So-
Why? If they're not essential, why not? You didn't open the door for anything else.
because they are staff.
You're gonna
Open
you're gonna
agreements.
have a hard time defining who's essential and who isn't here.
And
Yes.
I would think that ultimately, the information gathered from this is helpful to the individuals, but I think it's also helpful to the population to know.
Absolutely.
It's
So
morally correct on all
to do
points.
this kind of study, or even if you want to consider it an experiment here in who has the antibodies, is probably valuable to everyone.
Absolutely.
Would, Madam Attorney, would you correct the resolution so we can reread that and then?
So it would read, resolved that upon the recommendation of Mayor Don Bryan, that the Board of Trustees hereby approve for the Village of Hempstead to enter into an agreement with Baseline Health to provide antibody testing to all village employees, including active members of the Hempstead Fire Department.
Thank you.
I have a question. And what's the time frame? That's
So,
very important. I mean, it
after
can't be
we-
for a whole year.
The Baseline Health is pretty backed up. Many of the municipalities are doing this right now. So I'm trying to find out what the respective dates are. I can tell you that Freeport got their contract signed last week, and they're scheduled to start testing next week. So the first full week of May. So
But I think it's
I
quite.
don't have an estimate for when they would get to Hempstead.
No, he was asking how long.
The other side of that.
Oh, how long the testing would take place?
Yeah, so it's not like this is a thing that they can be testing all year long.
A week,
No.
what's the window?
2
No.
days.
We would pick the days. It's just a few days.
That's important.
Sorry, I misunderstood your question.
Would be on whose time?
Okay.
Whose time would this be on? Is this on village time?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is a less intrusive test, less painful test, is that correct?
This is the finger stick, the blood
Okay.
test.
Oh, that's all it is?
Yes, but if someone, antibodies indicate that they are positive, then within 24 hours, they do have to go get the nasal swab. And the company will refer them to a doctor who will do that for them within 24 hours.
Now, do we cover that course also?
No,
That's
And
if they
there
test
are 4
positive.
results.
that's what the antibodies indicate.
And Madam Attorney, there are 4 results. You can either be cleared of all, or you could actually find that 1 or 2 things are the score is wrong, or you can have both. So there's 4 ways to come back.
You can find out that you've
These are the
never been
antibodies.
exposed. You can find out that you have been exposed. You can find out that, you have been exposed and your body is actively fighting it, or you have high levels of the virus still in your system.
Okay,
There are also false negatives and false positives.
Yeah,
yeah.
thank you.
It matters what the quality of this test is. Is this the top quality test that's being provided? Do we know that? Because some of them have up to a 30% failure rate.
Wow. That high?
Yeah, for the antibody test. And some of them not approved yet.
Yeah, and
This
I'm
has
sure
been
this
approved by
company.
the FDA.
Oh, that's.
This was approved by them.
Okay.
All right, any more questions? Trustee Johnson?
Yes.
Trustee Hobbs?
Yes.
Trustee Renfro?
Yes.
Trustee Daniels?
Yes.
Mayor Ryan?
Yes.
Have a motion to close, please?
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
Trustee Johnson?
Yes.
Trustee Hobbs?
Yes.
Trustee Renfro?
Yes.
Trustee Daniels?
Yes.
Mayor Ryan?
Yes.